I'm Cass Dowding, and this is The Sentimental Gardener, a podcast sharing other people's stories, rich with memories and meaning connected to plants and gardens. You know that feeling when you walk into a garden or a beautiful outdoor space and you can just feel your shoulders drop? When something in your body goes, but it happens even before your mind knows it's happened? There's actually a name for that. It's the exhale factor. And understanding exactly why that happens when we're in green spaces has become my guest's life work. Sandra Schwarz is a landscape architect, author and former teacher who swapped the classroom for something completely different after she heard a designer talking to her teenage students about turning concrete waterways back into rivers. That moment changed everything for her, and she knew that this was something and a field that she wanted to follow. It led her from Melbourne to Sweden, from teaching teenagers to researching rehabilitation gardens, and from wondering why green spaces make us feel better to actually proving it. Sandra's journey is one of following her curiosity wherever it leads. A study exchange in Sweden revealed what would become her PhD focus. What are therapeutic spaces? What can they do for us? And how are we when we're in them? Her curiosity took her to Sweden's Alnarp rehabilitation garden, and there she studied how the different garden rooms helped people heal from chronic stress. She explores places like Gartnaval's Maggie Centre, and closer to home, she volunteers at Royal Talbot Rehabilitation Hospital with nurse and horticultural therapist Stephen Wells. She's poured all of this experience and knowledge into a soon-to-be-released book called Restore: How Green Spaces Support Human Restoration. Through the book, she translates all that academic research into practical recommendations for people like landscape architects, garden designers, home gardeners, or just passionate plant people who want to create spaces that actually heal. Now, Sandra calls them green spaces rather than gardens because not everything that heals us fits into neat traditional categories. So when you hear her say that word on the podcast, there's actually a reason behind it. Today's podcast is very comprehensive in that there's a lot of information, but Sandra does a brilliant job in explaining it in a way that regardless of if you're a landscape architect with lots of background knowledge or you're just a home gardener, you will be able to take away the fundamental elements of what it means to build a garden that heals. Today's podcast goes for about an hour and a half. The first section is to do with her early memories of gardens. The middle part is to do with the research that's found in her book. And the last part are the sentimental stories she has of some of the gardens she visited in Europe. I learned so much from the time I had with Sandra, and I really hope you enjoy today's podcast. Sandra Schwarz, welcome to the Sentimental Gardener podcast.
Thank you so much. Glad to be here.
It's an honour to have you here.
Thank you.
When I start these podcasts, I love to jump back all the way to the beginning and ask, when you think back to your earliest memories of gardens, what memory lingers most vividly for you?
It's an interesting one because I think a few of the podcasts that are out there looking at green spaces think of that. And I don't have my grandma was a gardener story. So as much as I think it's always been part of my life in some way, in saying that I grew up until the age of 8 in Germany. And so we lived in an apartment, so we didn't have a garden. But certainly there was always green space around, and we did actually have, they're not really allotment gardens, but they're a special type of garden that is often, especially along train lines in Germany and other parts of Europe, where you have a garden space that's separate. You're not allowed to live there, but you can have a hut on it or something like that you can overnight, but you're not allowed to live there permanently. And we had one of those. And I remember my auntie and uncle and my cousins being next door. And then our neighbours were down that path of that row as well. I guess that they are my earliest memories of it just being part of our life. And those neighbours, because obviously we moved to Australia, and then my auntie and uncle, I don't think, had their garden for much longer either once we moved. But those neighbours still had it until recently when they unfortunately passed away. And I remember always going back to that garden. Like if ever I visited them in Germany, it would be going to see that. And it was all about the food growing and the abundance of tomatoes and look at my new crop of this and that sort of thing. And then also we would always go and see family who lived in another part of Germany as a child. We would go there for Easter, and that was the Easter egg hunt in their garden. And they had a property where the grandparents owned a house that backed onto the house of the older children, but both their gardens faced each other. So it was quite a large green space, and that would be every year, our Easter egg hunt and being outdoors. So they're the childhood memories around it, but not something where I would say my parents were great gardeners or anything like that. But then when we moved to Australia as well, we moved into and had, like, our house was built. I think it was already sort of on the plan, but we were the first people that lived in it, and Mum and Dad still do. And it was a fairly new street at that time, so in the early 80s. And the garden was just part of the house. You know, you didn't, it wasn't just about the house. You built a garden, and so Mum and Dad did that. I don't feel like I was particularly involved in it. It was just this ubiquitous thing, is that, yes, of course you have a garden and you look after it, but in a way it was Mum and Dad's garden, not so other than me playing in it. But we often talk about the fact that because we were one of the first people to move into that street, the fact that we focused on the garden seemed to inspire other people. And so other people would, oh, yeah, actually we'll do our front garden as well. So it's more of a ubiquitous thing sort of in the background of my life rather than this kind of deeper thing or experience. But, yeah, it is definitely later. And I know once I moved out on my own, that's when I was like, okay, this is my space. I get to, create this now. That's when it became like, okay, this is now about what I'm doing with it. So there's not sort of that pivotal garden space, but just something that was always there, but never a focus until I got back to it. So.
Thinking back to Germany, was it common that people had those spaces, like the little garden,
like the allotment kind of space? Yeah,
like a lot of people had them.
Yeah, and they're usually on like it'll be railway owned land, so they are usually along railway. So if you go on a train journey, you'll see lots of them. They're slightly bigger than I guess what we would think of as an English allotment, because it's not just veggie growing. Like for us, it was definitely. It had a hut, and we've got old, 8mm video or film of me being on a swing there. So it was more just a green play space rather than a garden as such. But yeah, it is pretty common. I think that they're pretty cheap to rent. And like I said, the neighbours that we had, I mean, theirs was just abundant with food production, and they have had it for probably about 50 years now.
Wow.
So like once people have it, it's a rental system. But I know a cousin of mine still has one. And they're often sort of close by, because the way that housing's done is you might have high-rise apartments, but they'll be closer. Like it's not like you have to drive half an hour to get there or anything like that. It's usually, someone will take a bike to go there and then there. But often ways of spending weekends, and then as you go in, like in eastern Germany or towards Poland, it's more like they're called Dutches, which are, these little sort of, holiday huts with the surrounding garden. So, yeah, they are. I think they are quite common. Generally speaking, obviously, there's a limit of how many you can have with a large population. It's only so much space. But, yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
It's
they're great.
so
They're
different,
beautiful
isn't
to
it?
look at as well, if you do take a train ride, because you just see all the different expressions of, how people create their gardens, whether it is for food production or a green space to relax in or, whatever.
And you've been back, have you? And
yeah, we
noticed
used to go
them?
back every couple of years.
Oh,
so,
cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love the thought of people making it their own. Like you said, it's not just for food. And it would be, that expression of whatever that person wanted to grow and almost, an expression of who they are.
Basically, I guess like we have gardens here, but just that it's separate to your house because your house has a balcony and is on the 5th floor. So it's, in a way, it's like your typical backyard. It's just your backyard isn't actually attached to your house. That's how I sort of look at it with those.
So you said, you didn't have like that experience of, a grandmother who gardened or that, but life sometimes pulls us towards places we're meant to be. So how did working in gardens first begin to call to you?
I think when I moved out on my own, so in my mid-20s, after some travel and finishing my education or teaching degree. And at that point, like I said, it was that real, okay, this is mine now, which I know is not a particularly lovely thought in the sense of, power and ownership and all that sort of stuff, but it's what it was. That was the 90s. My thinking was a bit different then. Yeah, and just that idea of it was just a small courtyard, but recreating it. So I put in a pond, I put in, plants, I moved plants that were there, and it was about, no, this is mine to create and style and move and I guess manipulate. So that's where it sort of came from, that I was interested, and it was a space to also grow food. And then after, because I did actually go back over to Germany to teach for a few years as well. So I was there for 4 years, had a couple of breaks in between. So I became a scuba dive instructor up in Queensland in between, but came back and when they were my own spaces, it was about how do I create that sanctuary for me and being outdoors as much as I could be. But that was just the hobby of gardening. And then I was starting to get ready to get out of teaching because I thought I don't want to hate it. I like, if I'm going to leave, I'll leave while I'm still okay with it. So we're sort of prepping for that. And in my final year of teaching, so which was 2014, I actually taught, because I was visual communication and design and then a bit of visual arts photography. And I taught a year 10 technical drawing unit, but because we didn't want it to be too dry, the point was that you created the garden with your fantasy house that you were technically drawing. And just watching, my own brain, but also watching those kids' eyes light up when I would say, well, why can't you have a green wall? What about a rooftop garden on your house? And just watching their eyes go, oh my Lord, yeah, I could do that. And it was just this joy of creation, but it was that joy of creation through thinking about plants and green spaces. And imagine if it was this and you were surrounded by greenery. And so as I left teaching, and a few years prior, there used to be a design conference hosted in Melbourne by Ken Cato, who was a graphic designer here, quite well known. And they would always, because a lot of high school students would attend, even though it was a tertiary conference, so to speak, they often then catered for the high school students that were coming anyway. And so they did a day where it was almost like short pockets of just people in really varied design industries talking about, this is how I got into it, this is what I do, to get those kids thinking about what design career future would I like to look into. So I remember one year it was the graphic designer for the titles for movies, like movie titles and movie intros. Then it was a fashion designer, and then Kate Cullity was one of the landscape architects who came and spoke. And the year after was Kongjian Yu, who's from Turinscape in China, who's like just making amazing restorations of riversides. And I came out of especially Kongjian Yu and just went, oh, imagine doing that. Like, imagine taking a concrete channel and turning it into a river again, like actually being this natural, beautiful space. And so when I had the break, I went, actually, I want to do that. Wow. I'm teaching kids to get to this point where they're going to uni to do this kind of career. And I thought, you know what? I want to do that. And so, as I was figuring it out, so I'd done a career test, and the two things that popped up for me as most likely to move into were landscape architecture or like conservation and curation, as in art conservation. And they both really interested me, but it was the garden side that pulled me in, where I went, actually, no, I'd like to work with green spaces and gardens. And so this is probably my one little story, almost like that garden that some people have, is that I thought, the only way to change careers was to go back to uni. I was like, okay, that's fine. So it worked out that was doable in terms of, financially being able to manage it. And then, but still in my head, if you'd asked me, is this going to happen, I would have thought, no, because I can't really afford the fees. How do I do this for 3 years without having income? How does all of this work? But I keep saying I had that, you always have the angel and the devil on your shoulder. The angel was louder and going, well, just go and ask. Just go and ask the question. And so I made an appointment with a student advisor, and by the end of that meeting, I was standing in the huge, beautiful atrium of the Melbourne School of Design with tears in my eyes going, oh, my Lord, this is going to happen.
Oh, wow.
This is possibly going to happen. Like, I can change, makes me teary now. I can, change my career, and this is possible. And it was things like, asking what's the turnover of application process, how do the fees work, how does and she answered all my questions and basically problem solved almost everything for me. And to the point of, which is so exceptional, was the help that I said to her, look, I can't quit my teaching job until I know I have a place. Like, I'm not dumping a career for a possibility. I have to know that I'm in. And so she said, no, that's fine. Just let me know when you've applied. I applied on Monday, and by Friday I had a yes, you're in.
Oh, that's awesome.
And was like, whoa, okay, this is happening. So that's where the garden side came from, because then I went, okay, landscape architecture it is. This is what we're doing. And it's for me, because I hadn't come from landscape architecture, it was a 3-year instead of a 2-year master's.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you started off with the master. You just went straight into a master's?
Because I already had the Bachelor of Education.
Mm-hmm.
They're often a bit funny about having you do a second bachelor, and so they were just like, no, masters. And that's why the 3-year masters at Melbourne was useful, because it was, mind you, it was a bit daunting, because we all kind of went, hang on, so what, we're catching up 4 years of bachelor in 1 year? Okay, no pressure. That's
a lot.
Yeah. And I'm not sure that we did, because I feel like there's a lot of gaps still in my knowledge, but that's okay. That's what lifelong learning is there for.
It's so true. How incredible. How incredible.
Yeah, it was
I love that.
Pretty quick turnaround in the end when it happened. So, very grateful to have changed and shifted, because that focus on gardens is very important. Wouldn't have it any other way now in my life.
Brilliant. I love that. Through your training at the university, was there a lot of focus on how to make beautiful gardens, or when did you realise that landscapes could be more than just beautiful places, that they could heal, and there was that therapeutic side?
I think essentially in Sweden, just purely because, and this is the differentiation between landscape architecture and either landscape design or garden design, which the edges are blurred. But I guess in a way, and I find this a little unfortunate, because we are effectively called the green architects, but I'm not so sure how true that is, because there's very little plant training within that. So several universities have like either nothing or one subject. So we had one compulsory, so one semester in 3 years.
About plants?
About plants.
Okay.
I took the second, and then lucky for me was that because there was a chance to do the exchange or the study abroad, I got more because I went overseas, and through circumstantial, because of my still German passport and everything, ended up doing the 2 years in Sweden rather than one, but got 1 year's worth of credit back here. So I think really that's where I probably found it. The focus in landscape architecture is often about programming, like as in what do you want people to do there, as in because it's usually bigger spaces. It's not usually a garden as such. Like it'll be a forecourt or a community space, or, you know, it could even, I mean, a lot of the things happening at the moment in Melbourne are around the, you know, the train lines and the level crossing changes. So it's those spaces, and it's looking at, okay, so what's going to happen there? Well, people are going to bike ride and walk. So that's the program. So it's usually more about that than it is about the plants, which is why a lot of landscape architects cop a lot of flack, because they have a very limited palette of plants that they use, and Lomandra should not always be part of that. So I think from that point of view, I probably started looking at it from a more garden side of things once I got to Sweden, and there was the rehab garden on the campus there. And so people and environment for us was about the environment of, well, we had different, it was cities, so, you know, like street art, and how does that impact the environment that you have in a city, looking at children's spaces and how can cities be made adaptable for children, etc. And obviously also a big topic is for aged people that are aging. But yeah, and then we spent quite a bit of time at the rehab garden, and so that was where it was like, wow, you guys, because the garden was built to research how various spaces impacted people who were being treated for chronic stress.
So chronic stress was the focus.
That was the focus when they started. They did diversify as they went on, but chronic stress, and I think part of that, from what I understood, was that because there was a bit of an epidemic of chronic stress in Sweden, where a lot of people were off work, and we're talking, like, to qualify to be part of the research, I think you had to have been off work for 2 years because you'd basically had a breakdown and couldn't cope with work, you know, normal life anymore because of the stress on you. And so that garden was created, and potentially they would have created it in the way that they did anyway, in terms of having lots of different rooms and spaces, because obviously that allowed different experiences. So people that were there for their treatment could choose what they felt comfortable in. So some people needed to go off into the wilder space, which was not as in not cared for, but just not very manicured at all, and potentially to some people a bit messy, but that was all that they could cope with, because as soon as it was manicured, it was like, oh, well, that's pressure on me, or I can't touch anything, or I need to help look after it. And so it was just this underlying sort of pressure that they couldn't cope with. And also in some of the research they talked about, like, there was a field, well, there's sort of a meadow and then a field next door, and people would just go off there and yell their heads off and scream if they needed to get that out. So having the space to do that, but again in much less manicured spaces, like it would be quite a wild meadow or just an agricultural field where it was space and you knew you weren't going to be heard or judged. And so, yeah, their research definitely started with stress rehabilitation, but then later I know that they looked at, because they had quite a few of the rooms that were hedged with hornbeam, they found that within Parkinson's disease there's actually, it's like a gate freeze, where if they have to walk through certain doorways, they freeze. There's just something about the visual of a doorway that blocks them. And so that was one study that was done at that garden to try and understand, how do you soften that, or how do you change the appearance of a doorway or a gateway threshold so that they don't get that freeze, because it can last, 30 seconds, couple of minutes, whatever. And then I think towards the end, before they closed, they were also looking at how to help new migrants integrate. So giving them gardening skills, which helped and supported their language skills. And also just, to gain an understanding about, you're new to the country, how does Swedish culture work? Because a lot of what they did there, like, there was very typical Swedish housing or house style with that typical red colour and white trim. And then just, like, what's the seasonality of Sweden? What's abundant right now? What can we not get? How do we share food? So fika is what they have as coffee. So there's lots of fika breaks in Sweden. Always like morning tea, lunchtime, afternoon tea. It's like, oh, are we having fika yet? It's like, right, we're having it again. Yeah, so that sort of thing. So that's that. They were at least 3, and I think there was another researcher who was my supervisor who I think did some work on dementia as well. So they were starting to mix it up a little bit into the different user groups, but predominantly it was built for let's research into stress, chronic stress. Yeah.
I notice you use the term green space.
Yes.
And, sometimes I'll say garden or landscape. Could you explain to me what you mean by green space compared to like a garden or a landscape?
I think it's exactly what you just said.
Okay.
Is that there can be a landscape which you're in and you know that you're not really in a garden.
Mm-hmm.
Like I don't know, it doesn't have some kind of, I guess, uniformity or signal that tells you this is a garden. You're definitely in, and probably more public open spaces. Yeah, so I guess I would call something like, certainly in the outer east, there's a few back tracks that are quite meadowy that have walking tracks that are like where the water pipelines are run, where a lot of people go walking. So to me, that's a green space because when it's not dry, like right now, that it's a green space, but I wouldn't call it a garden.
Yep, gotcha.
But then on the other hand, a lot of times I think there are connotations for green space as well. The reason I've used it certainly within the book is because it's a more generalised term. So I'll be quite specific if I'm talking about a garden. But with the spaces that I'm talking about, so for example, the High Line in New York, I wouldn't call that a garden. To me, it's a green space because it's a linear park. So it starts to I guess, break through that definition of a garden in itself. So that's why I was trying to sort of make it more universal and more broad. Certainly it includes gardens, but it can also be like Ballast Point Park, that's in Sydney. And it's a park. It's definitely a park. I wouldn't call it a garden. Yeah, more expansive in a way, but it's also not just a landscape.
Yep.
It is a green space. Like there is definitely a focus on planting or that sort of thing. So yeah, it is a tricky definition to have, but it's just trying to aim to be a bit more broad than purely a garden, but it can also become a landscape because it can't be defined as a garden.
Yeah, I think it's great. It helps that universality that you're trying to go for. Speaking of your book, the book feels like an invitation to see green spaces differently. So what truth are you hoping to share through it?
Oh gosh, so many.
Well, what's the main one, do you think?
I think the main thing is just for people to value green space and that we need it. Like this isn't, lots of people are now talking about we are nature, and that's true. We are, and we need to stop actually separating ourselves from these spaces. It makes me quite scared about how all the McMansions that have, that take up the vast majority of their footprint on their land plots with no garden, no green space, let alone lawn. Not that I think lawn is what needs to be included, but you get councils that say, you must plant a tree, and it's like, well, where would you like me to do that? Because you've left me no footprint to do that. As in, I think councils should not be allowing such large house footprints on properties, and in some cases they're not, or they're not supposed to, so I'm not quite sure how they're getting around that. But it's so seeing the value of actually all of these green spaces, and I think it comes back to the previous question of that's why I'm calling them green spaces. Not everything is going to be a garden, but if you can have some greenery around you, that is a value, and we all need it. And as soon as we start, as Gina Chick talks about, that if we enclose ourselves in walls and we actually block the views out and we don't see any of that greenery, we don't see, like we look at our phone apps to find out what the weather is, stick your head out the front door. Like it's that kind of simplicity of that we keep making these apps and devices and other ways that are meant to be more efficient, but it's actually pulling us away from just judging look up at the sky. What is it doing? Are there clouds coming? Well, yes, it may rain later. Or actually the sky is quite grey. It's probably going to rain. I'll grab a raincoat instead of looking at our phone app and radar. So it's the valuing that connection. And then within that, obviously, with the specifics of the book, which is how do we do that from a design point of view, which is what my thesis in Sweden was trying to grapple with, was how can I as a designer support that kind of restoration? Like what can I build in? What is pretty much in every garden that's talked about as being restorative? Because it is quite a nebulous, quality to achieve. But I think if we can have a foundation that you can kind of say, if you can put these things in, you've almost got a guarantee of it being, it's highly probably going to be restorative if you've done it well. I mean, there's designers out there that are definitely doing it, but some of it is just pure instinct rather than actually going, have I asked this question? Have I thought about this? And that's why in the book I call them considerations, because I'm asking designers, just consider this, consider how this works for that user and how it can be done so that you can include these things. And it's, it's simple things that most people I think already know to some degree, which is things like water. So how can you include water? And in some circumstances you won't be able to because the infection risk is too great or safety risk or whatever. But if you're asking that question already, it's like, well, can we include it in some way? Maybe it's not an open pond, but maybe it's a bird bath. How can we include those things? Because we know they're proven to be restorative. So those two things are the main, which is the valuing these spaces and also actually like how much and what they can give us in terms of restoring us in these times. And then the second thing that's come out of the book for me is that all of that actually brings us back to building community, which we're so desperately needing right now. And I'm hearing more and more talk about it, so it's great because clearly it's a topic, but it's that really hard thing to figure out how do you build community? And green spaces are just this really lovely vehicle, I think, to do that because you can talk very easily, and it's part of the research that it's really easy to talk while you're gardening. It's very easy to talk if you're sitting side by side in a green space, because you've got the privacy and the calm and the the atmosphere that just supports that kind of conversation happening. So I keep coming back in conversations at the moment to this idea, and I think I might have said it to you previously as well, that we always say it takes a village to raise a child, and I feel like we've lost the village because we don't talk to our neighbours enough. We engage with people via apps rather than actually talking to them. Yes, we're global, but we're not really making that, and I know this has different connotations as well, but we're not making that more intimate, actual personal contact with people, and I think that's what we're losing. And I just keep seeing how important that is. So in therapeutic horticulture, if you look at, what community gardens do and even just what gardens themselves do for people, it builds capacity. Well, that allows you then to either help somebody else or to talk to somebody else. And so you're making a connection, you're making community. So I'm not quite sure how it's all coming to that, but I feel like it keeps coming back to that as I've been writing this. And it's in the evidence as well. Like a lot of the theories that are out there about green spaces is that the more green space we have, and especially now in children, we're more empathetic. We're more happy to help somebody else. We're more, we're calmer. So we have more capacity to help somebody else. So it's that strange thing that initially when you hear the comment, green spaces or gardens will have you connect with other people, but it's so true and it's proven, like it's out in the research, they're showing it. And surely, any parent would want their kid to be empathetic and being able to connect to somebody else. We'll put them in a green space because that will automatically support that just because of what it does to, their cortisol and their nervous system. Yeah, and their attention and everything. So, yeah, it's fascinating.
So you've got all of this research.
Yep.
And we've got all of the evidence.
Yeah.
And then what's your journey like trying to bridge that gap between evidence and like real world practice?
Well, the book, doing the book, I guess, is exactly that, because that's what my thesis was actually called in Sweden, which started all this, which was turning the research into practice. And I guess, that is really the whole aim of the book, is to say, look, I realise that especially once people are in the profession, there's no time to do the academic reading. A lot of the academic reading you can't access unless you're part of an institution. And just the time, like they are tiring to read. And so I've said in the book, it's like, so I've done the reading for you. I've pulled it all together. Here's what I found, hopefully in a slightly easier manner to read and all in one place. And then that's, again, why I say that these are considerations, because it's like I've done the reading, I've done the research for you. Here's the findings. Here's what that actually looks like in practical terms. So I've sort of feel like I've done the prep work for others, and hope that will then allow them to use the book in whatever way they choose to put it into practice. So, hopefully I'm bridging that gap. I think it'll potentially still be a little bit academic for some people, which is perhaps the next step of where I take it, of trying to work out how do I just simplify these things or synthesize it in a different way that makes it even more usable. I've started doing that at the back of the book with the matrix and the gradients, but it also allows slightly deeper delving, because that's where it starts getting more specific again. So it's that real fine balance between providing a depth of research and a depth of, I guess, knowledge and understanding and curiosity, but also still keeping it fairly simple to use. But I'm hoping this is a bit of a prompt to do exactly that, which is to bridge that gap. So and other than that, I'll keep working on it.
Sounds like it's going to be a great tool for a whole load of different people in different professions. So you've got your academics who maybe this is new material that they could introduce into, their teaching. And then it's the practicals for landscape architects or even home gardens designers who, might go, I never thought to incorporate water or how that could actually benefit. So
the initial idea was, I guess, to predominantly focus on landscape architects, because they're the practitioners who need that information and don't generally have the time to do it, let alone that their processes don't really allow for that level of research. The academics, it might just bring a few different and new viewpoints together. So absolutely from that point of view. But it was actually a really early conversation with a friend of mine who, unfortunately, when I met him, had lost his wife just about 3 to 6 months earlier. And we were talking about the gardens, and we actually had this conversation at Maranoa Gardens in Baldwin, I think it is, about how much benefit and balm and soothing and respite you can get from green spaces. And talking to him, the idea of the book was just germinating. And I explained to him, I think this is what I'd like it to be. And he said, Sandra, that would have been great to know when my wife was ill, because we could have adjusted our garden to be that, within scope or reality, I guess. And so that made me then realise that actually maybe this has scope to go beyond just landscape architects. So I hope that is what it will do. I guess, as I say, predominantly it will be landscape architects or garden designers. But certainly, I hope that it does. It feels like it's definitely a drawing attention by not necessarily garden designers, like more, whether it's their home or people who are interested in getting into this, people who are interested in therapeutic horticulture, that kind of thing. So it does seem to have a broader reach. So we'll see. We'll see what the future of it holds.
So you've chosen 3 sentimental gardens. Let's talk about the first one. So Alnarp.
So Alnarp is the campus that I was on during my Swedish stay. So it's a campus, one of 2 campuses for the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, which I will now refer to as SLU because it's too much of a mouthful. It's the Alnarp
Rehab Trädgård, which is rehabilitation garden, and it was on the campus. Now, I was very excited about going to Alnarp because when I got the placement or the place, I said to people, I'm going to a campus that has a castle in a park, in a forest, by the beach. I'm like, can you get a more idyllic setting to go study landscape architecture? I don't think so. So it's in the region of Skåne in southern Sweden, which is around the city of Malmö. And I'd been there before, so I knew that I really liked Malmö. And it's just across the ditch from Copenhagen. And it's quite a hub for rehabilitation for stress because Ulrika Stigsdotter, who is now in Denmark at the University of Copenhagen, she did her PhD at Alnarp and then obviously went back across the ditch and created her own garden there called the Nicadia Healing Forest. And so it was quite a hub. And as part of my thesis, there was also one more rehabilitation garden in that area of Skåne that I looked at. Unfortunately, that garden, literally the woman who owned it came to my thesis presentation and told me that day that it was closing or it was being sold. And then I finished in 2019 and Alnarp Rehab Garden actually closed as that function at the end of 2019 as well. So unfortunately, both of those gardens in my thesis are now gone or gone in that purpose because Alnarp obviously is still there, but it's just being used for other things. But yeah, it's the reason that I picked that as sort of my first example is probably because it just changed my whole direction of where I was going because as I said to you or you've mentioned already with people in the environment, that subject was our second subject at Alnarp, which meant that it was like the second quarter in because they do their units that you do one subject at a time for 10 to 12 weeks and then move on. So it's not like you don't do 2 or 3 subjects a semester. You do 2 or 3, but you do them after each other. Yeah, it's very concentrated and it's good if you love it, not so good if you hate it. But that subject was fascinating and we did our first introduction to it was to go to the garden and we all just got told to go find a spot in the garden that made us feel comfortable and that we wanted to sit or lie or walk or be in for about, half an hour. And so I found a seat and I pulled myself off a leaf of a Stachys byzantium, so lamb's ear, and I just sat there kind of stroking that and just listening to what was happening around me. Different people found different spots. So some people were drawn to the pond and sat next to the water on a rock. Somebody else went and lay on a sheepskin under a shrub. Different people. So whatever you felt comfortable with, that is where you were asked to be and just experience the place. And I think I walked out of that session and said to my fellow students, well, I know what my thesis is going to be about, which was literally, like I'm talking week 10 of, 2 years. And they all looked at me and went, what? And I said, yep, it's going to be something about this, like something about therapeutic spaces and what they can do for us and how we are in them and that sort of thing. So, yeah, that garden's really quite important because without having gone to Sweden, I'm not sure how I would have discovered that here. There is a subject that has been taught and I've now thankfully or very gratefully been able to help with that, which is therapeutic landscapes at Melbourne University, which I believe is coming back next year, so fingers crossed. So very grateful to have found Alnarp Rehab Trädgård. And just fascinated by this idea of it's the arts and crafts kind of idea of having rooms in a garden, but it was done for a very practical reason. So it's not an arts and craft garden. It's just this idea of rooms that go back to what you'd mentioned earlier about having capacity to be in different spaces. So like the seat that I sat in for that first experience was a timber swing seat where you're surrounded by hornbeam hedge. And so you can still hear people, but you can't be seen. You're very private. You're very enveloped by greenery. You're sitting in amongst sort of perennial planting. So depending on the time of year, it was quite bright, very mixed, but surrounded by greenery. And there it's quite important that they talk, or that their paths are gravel so that you can hear people coming, because you will have people that are at a point in their treatment, particularly early on, where they just don't have the capacity to deal with somebody else. Like, not in a nasty way in anything, just purely like can't talk to somebody right now. I'm busy holding myself together, let alone talking to somebody else or having some kind. And it's just that implicit demand from another person that you're expected to be polite or you're expected to engage in some way, and they just can't. They're still so stressed that they just can't. And so the gravel is there so that somebody walking near you, you're alerted to, okay, someone's nearby. All right, I may need to leave this area, and that's my choice. I can choose to leave, but I'm also alerted to the fact that somebody else is coming. So I'm being warned that I may have to deal with something in a second. And so that kind of finding coming out of their research was just fascinating to me, that, like, just by choosing your path material, you're already supporting somebody being warned. And one thing that I've definitely talked about in the book, and potentially more than I possibly academically should have, but it just has rung so true to me, is the idea of having 2 escape routes for any space. So there's always 2 ways in and out at Alnarp, which means that if somebody enters your space, you can still exit without having to actually be near them or interact with them. And I think that to me is really important, because if you're feeling at all threatened or uncomfortable with somebody else coming into a space, you don't then want to feel trapped as well. You don't want to be like, oh, well, I'm in a corner and you're trying to come into this space. And it's not nice for the other person coming in either, because you're going, oh, I've just intruded on you, and actually you're in that seat, so I'll leave again. So it's sort of like you can avoid the awkwardness by just having 2 ways in and out. So again, very easy design thing to do that actually really helps somebody, especially at that early stage of treatment. So that was one space, was these 4 rooms that were all hedged by the hornbeam, which obviously changes colour over the year as well. And then there was a space with the small pond that had a hammock between 2, and you could be quite hidden if you were in that hammock. And there was a gentleman who had worked, before I got there, had worked at SLU for as an academic, but he'd had, I think, a bike or a car accident. And so he kind of became his own test case, because he had the brain injuries that he had to work out again. And he helped. I think the initial paper wasn't written by him, just because at that point he couldn't, but he could tell somebody, and so they helped him write a paper about how, as he was going through the stress of his rehabilitation, that rocks and water were this really soothing element, because it put no pressure on him. He said it's a sign of permanence, it's a sign of age, it's something that's not going to change. And it just asks nothing of me. It doesn't ask me to engage, it doesn't ask to be cared for, it's just this really supportive element that demands nothing from me, but gives me a place to be grounded. So things like that were all in the garden. And then really interestingly, they had a corner of it where they were literally testing, because both the rehab garden and also a space called the landscape lab were very much these one-to-one scale laboratories for testing, doing the research and actually trying stuff out. So how do we thin trees? How do we create this? How do we make these spaces what they are? And so one space was quite hardscaped. So it was concrete on the ground. There was a concrete water rill. So still water, but in a very different way. And then they'd brought in some raised beds that could be reached by people in wheelchairs if they needed, but also just generally very easy to access and contained. And there was a geodesic dome there as well, because they had 2 spaces that were seasonal shelter.
What's a geodesic dome?
Basically a half circle, so literally a half dome, but it's made out of triangles.
Oh, wow.
So the whole structure is, I think it's actually a lot of what the Eden Project is like. But
awesome.
So it's a dome, but it's made out of triangles that interlock to each other to create a frame. And the Scandinavian gardens especially, I found, are very big on having greenhouses or a dome or something like that, because they know that seasonally they just can't And the nice thing about it is as well is that all of those spaces either let sunlight in or literally are see-through, so you can look out. So you're still enjoying the landscape, but you're sheltered from the wind and the rain.
And you're warm.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, exactly. So, yeah, this hard space or hardscape, so obviously it has the shelter and it's got definitely good qualities in terms of people being able to reach the raised beds and things like that. But it's definitely a space that less people feel comfortable in because of the hardscaping, because of the concrete. And it's just not soft enough. It's missing that greenery. So, yes, there's some plants, but it's definitely missing the soft aspect. So they found that basically people either didn't like that space at all, which interesting. It's great that they still tried it, because it's the sort of thing that a lot of studies had found, there's definitely a preference for natural versus urban spaces, but these guys actually tested it and were like, okay, how do you feel while you're here? Or they were able to be there, but later in their treatment when they felt more comfortable and more sociable.
How interesting.
Yep. So, yeah, so it's just a really interesting space. Feels very homey. You walk in, and one of the nice things is as well is you can't be anywhere but Sweden, because it's got the falu red of the timber cladding of the house, and just those lovely aspects of, well, it's Danish hygge, but that coziness that the Swedes or Scandinavians generally are just really good at. So having, like they would share their harvests, and as things were being harvested from the food garden, it would be out on drying rack. So you could either taste it or at least see that it was happening. So it's very much about embracing that interaction with nature. Like it was being in the space, and obviously most of the therapy was about that, but also the food side of it. And then even like in the meadow area, they had what would essentially be kind of a gazebo-style structure, but it was planted with hops, so that as that grew up and over. So just this very integrated approach to how the garden was, and just offered loads of variety of choice, which is really important in restorative gardens, is to have that choice of where do I feel comfortable today to be. Like, do I want to be in a more formalised space where I can tell people have been here and they're caring for the space, but also am I expected to help care for that space? And as I said earlier, it's that connotation also of, if it's manicured, I'm not allowed to touch it because it's too pristine. So, yeah, so just really a very interesting and practical kind of tangible way of understanding how all of these different qualities impact on what we perceive and how we exist in a space.
Shall we move on to your second garden?
Sure.
In Gartnaval, Maggie's Centre?
Mm-hmm. So this is my favourite Maggie's, and I've seen quite a few because, as I said, for my thesis in Sweden, I looked at 6 case studies at that time. So 3 were stress management or stress rehabilitation, and 3 were cancer care. So there were 3 Maggies. I was in Sweden from 2017 to 2019. And in the mid-summer break in 2018, I travelled around the UK looking at Maggie's, which are phenomenal spaces, and yeah, so great that they exist because they support the cancer care of existing cancer centres, but they're all about making the institutional, which by necessity is what it is, but they look at turning that into the domestic scale. So they're always attached to a cancer care centre or cancer care hospital. They don't provide specific medical care. They're there to support that. So they're there to support the information, just the sort of mental and pastoral care, and to give people a space to be that's not institutional, basically. So they are what we call design by architects who, kindly do that as on a pro bono basis. So they're amazing buildings. And as opposed to the gardens I've got to know more recently, which are Horatio's gardens that are connected to spinal injury, the Maggie Centres started their focus as the building. And obviously being in the UK, weather is not always conducive to being in a garden or in an outdoor space, so it makes sense that that's where they started. I think they're starting to now focus a little more on the outdoor spaces, and they've certainly had people like Pete Rudolph and Dan Pearson and Tom Stewart-Smith, amongst many others, designing their garden spaces, but also in some contexts there's just no room for for gardens. So St Bart's in London, just there's hardly any space. It's on the rooftop and it's great, but there's nothing further because where they were allowed to build it, there is no outdoor space.
Okay.
So Gartnaval. So Gartnaval is in Glasgow, and they are very lucky to actually have quite a bit of space around them. So at Gartnaval, you find the car park, and then you sort of look up the hill and there's a group of trees. And actually, if you peek through them, that's where you see the building. So it's very nestled into its space at the top of a slight hill. And yeah, so you walk up and into the space through a little birch copse, which are one of my favourite trees. And it's just this really quite closed, sheltered kind of building. And it's created at Rem Koolhaas, I think his name is, Dutch designer. So it's a building that's almost like a bunch of rectangles that's been connected to create a type of donut. So in the middle you have a courtyard, which is beautiful and lush. So all of the rooms essentially look out onto the courtyard, and then a lot of them also look out onto the birch copse at the beginning. And then as you head towards the back of the property, it becomes a mixed beech forest, which already existed and they worked into. And so you're basically surrounded by greenery. And the design, which was created by Lily Jenks' studio in collaboration with someone else, whose name I can't recall, sorry, that she was the daughter of Maggie Jenks, who Maggie's is named after, and Charles Jenks, who was an architect. And basically the whole story of Maggie's is that Maggie had cancer, and her experience was, this isn't good enough. This is not how people should be spoken to about this kind of condition. This is not the type of place we want to be in where you're being told about that kind of diagnosis. It has to be better. And so in 1995, the first Maggie Centre in Edinburgh, which I did visit this time, which is also beautiful, was created. Unfortunately, Maggie knew it was happening, and apparently she actually passed away with the plans sitting on her bed. So she knew it was happening, but unfortunately didn't see it to completion. But it's certainly a legacy that's gone on ever since. And Lily Jenks, her daughter, is a landscape architect and created Gartnaval. And like I say, it really is my favourite because it just feels so... You just feel hugged by greenery. Like it's just this warm, loving, comforting embrace of greenery no matter where you are. It features as the cover of my book, which is one of my favourite spots, which is actually a quite narrow hallway. But on one side it has all glass towards the beech forest, and to the other side is full mirror. So you're mirroring that green landscape. So you come around the corner of this little hallway that takes you around to where the staff area is, and there's a sitting nook at each end, but you walk in and it's just like this gentle but explosion of greenery. And so it's, even though you're really indoors, like you're with hard stuff, it's mirror and glass, but it feels so soft. Like it just feels like you're in a greenhouse, and it's just this beautiful. And then there's a timber ceiling as well, so it's natural materials, and it's just this beautiful space. And as you walk around, because all of the Maggie centres are completely open, there's nothing that's blocked, so anyone can access the staff area. It's not like a closed door office or anything like that. The part of the Maggie's brief is always to have the kitchen be the centre space, so it has to have a table for at least 12 people because they do a lot of mentoring and pastoral care there. It's about being able at any time to go and help yourself to a cup of tea. But at Gartnaval, no matter which room you're in, you always can see greenery. Like there's nothing where you don't have a view to a garden space of some sort. And it's just hugely comforting. It's a really beautiful, very adaptable space as well, very flexible in terms of being able to close walls. So if they do a group yoga session, they can close a section off, but otherwise they'll leave it open so that you can see the birch copse. And the way that Lily actually designed it is that the building sits slightly lower. So there's like a little berm
where the birch copse actually start. So you're quite nestled. But then because you're looking out over the hill towards the car park, it goes from being nestled and, bunkered down and really settled into the earth to looking out over it and being almost cantilevered, but you're looking into the canopy of the beech tree. So it's just, I just find it a really lovely. And as I say, Gartnaval's really lucky, and they definitely recognise this as well, that they are very lucky to have had the space, because that beech forest out the back was part of the property already. So Lily designed around it. But it's just, it's a really, you can't. And this is, I think when I first met you and was talking about, when I asked people for examples for this book, I would, have you got any green spaces that they just really made you feel better? And people would probably 90% of the time go, oh, okay, so a therapeutic space. And I'd say, no, not necessarily. Yes, it might be therapeutic, but that's not what I'm looking for. It doesn't necessarily need to be the intent, and it certainly doesn't need to be its purpose. I would say to people, if you can just think of a green space you went to, doesn't matter if it was private, public, wherever, that you walked out and just came, And Hugh Main in Spirit Level in Sydney, he talks about it's the exhale factor. And it really is, because that's how I explained it to people, and then he called it that. And I was like, that's it. That's what I'm talking about. Good. It's the exhale factor. You walk into the space and you exhale because your shoulders drop, you relax, and you know that you're already starting to feel better, and that's how Gartnaval makes me feel. And I think a lot of other people. But
I've asked the other podcasts I've done, one of the questions I asked people was, how do you feel when you're in your garden or a space that they love? And it's that exhale.
It's the exhale factor, yeah.
And it's a relief, and like you said, it's the body's physical response to relax.
Yep. And that's where the evidence comes from as well, is it lowers our cortisol levels, it ups our dopamine, our heart rate comes down. It's all it is a real thing. It's not just us going, oh, I feel better. It's, no, it's been proven. It's been proven to across the wazoo, actually.
Yeah. Believe us, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's a real thing. But because we don't have a name for it yet. I think that Hugh does put it really well. It's the exhale factor.
The exhale factor.
Yep.
Love it.
Yep.
Shall we move on to your third garden? Due to volunteering, you have quite a fondness for the Royal Talbot Rehabilitation Centre.
Yeah. So I volunteer once a week with Stephen Wells, who's a horticultural therapist and nurse. And so once I'd done my thesis, which was the research sort of part of where all this started in Sweden, I came back and I knew I would need to do a thesis here as well. It's fine. Most people looked at me like I was nuts just accepting that. And I thought, there's no point arguing with that. Just do it. And so for me, it was about then trying to translate or check, were the same things that I was finding in Scandinavia true here. And so here it was about trying to find some gardens or green spaces to look at that I could test what I'd found against. And for me at that point, it was about, can I recognise these qualities, and can I find them, and are they actually showing up? And therefore, how are we seeing people use the spaces that actually show us that it's working? Because there wasn't as much research here about those spaces, because obviously Alnarp was created for that purpose, whereas here that's not what Royal Talbot Rehab Centre was built for. So the Friends Garden was built in 2005, and then the adjoining part of it was 2007, and it was basically the two spaces that today are one space, which are just outside of Stephen's office, where he does horticultural therapy or therapeutic horticulture with clients, is green space that surrounds a covered walkway. So it's a walkway that staff and patients have to go through anyway. It creates a walking circuit for a lot of people who are learning to deal with a wheelchair for the first time or learning to walk again. It's obviously a really relaxing space to be in. There's loads of staff that will have their lunch in there or just pop out for a phone conversation, things like that. And one space especially gets used quite a lot for sort of more private
conversations, or just where you want to have a conversation but you don't want to be indoors. So the space definitely gets used quite a bit. And yesterday when I was there for my session, I had 2 family members from patients who actually stopped me and said, "Oh, you're doing a great job in the garden. Thanks so much," and how valuable it is. So that's amazing to hear. Yeah, and so as for my thesis, I looked at the Royal Talbot because just before I went overseas, I heard Stephen speak, which was the result of his Churchill Fellowship. So he'd done a Churchill Fellowship around the maintenance and sort of longevity and what systems need to be put in place to make these kinds of spaces last. And he'd presented at the Botanic Garden. And so I think at the time I nearly dropped to my knees and grovelled, "How can I help?" And then when I came back, did the same thing of just, "Please, please, please, how can I help? Like, how can I be part of this?" And thankfully they have a volunteer program. And I, by that stage, knew Stephen. And so, yeah, came back, wanted to find out how the Scandinavian side of things fit here. So I chose the Royal Talbot Rehabilitation Centre garden, or that main garden, and 3 place spaces at the Peter Mac Cancer Care Centre. So same kind of audience to a degree, other than the specialising in acquired brain injury or spinal injury at the Royal Talbot, and found very similar thing. I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's Western cultures versus Western cultures, so very similar needs. And watched people use the space basically for my thesis, and from there again just went please can I help? And so started volunteering there just as COVID started. So I think I literally got my induction done, and the next day we went into lockdown. But I've been there technically for 4 years now. But the first year, I think we could say that I wasn't really there. So I am the chief possum poo and bird bath cleaner and renewer. But it's interesting because when you sort of say that, and I don't mind that at all because that's, needs to be done. But the magpies love it. They love the bluebird baths, getting refreshing. Like, there's actually at the moment a family where we know there's a young one, and they watch me. They're waiting for the water to get renewed, and then they'll come and bathe in it.
Wow.
So it's really, you're making a difference when bath time's about to happen. I'm cleaning your water. It's fine, thanks. And yeah, just realising that how much people use the space. So, I'm blowing away the leaves, and I can tell that it's making a difference. So it's just that little bit of support from that. And it's what the research talks about as signs of care, which is that it's not about being pristine, but it's about showing that, yes, there's somebody there who's going to make sure you're not walking on a pile of them. Or, like, I think last week it actually was that there was a crop of bromeliads that had the leaves all over them, and I, pulled them all out, or as much as I could out. And so therefore you could all of a sudden see the blossoms that were happening, and they're so vibrant. Like, there's this beautiful transition from purple to pink. And just after I did that, a couple of staff members walked past, and one said to the other, "Oh, look at those, look how they're popping out." And I was like, "Yep, that's because I just moved the leaves, because you wouldn't have seen them otherwise." And it was just that little thing that you think, yep, this is making a difference. And it's the fact that a staff member is noticing that. Now, we talk often with Stephen about the impact of, even for that staff member who you can tell is rushing through the space, it's still 2 minutes of respite on their eyes, whether it's the colour green, whether it's the fractals, whether it's like they're not in a hard space. So even if they're not noticing it, they're still getting respite. And then the bigger evident respite of happening through the patients that are there. And obviously if they then do the therapeutic horticulture with Stephen, it's even more, because they're touching it, they're feeling it, they're smelling it. But yeah, it's just that, I guess, goes back to what the book's about, of that raised awareness of the value of this, like how much better this is making you feel. And even if it's just that 2 minute respite between your jobs, and maybe that person will walk a touch slower because they're understanding that. Or, like at the moment there's a particular group of staff who come and sit in the same spot every time. And now it's the first time in 3 years but they're now doing it regularly. And so understanding that, yes, you get that respite and calm and stop, or what Hugh again talks about with the exhale factor, but that he looks at specifically dialing down stimulation for that. So not having, this amazing bloom cacophony kind of thing. It's actually, no, let's just do green on green on green on green and a bit of silver, because this is about dialing your stimulation down. So there's pockets like that. Yeah, so I think a lot of it is respite that people may not even really be aware of.
I love that it's not just for the patients, it's also for staff. Because I remember when I used to be a nurse and you'd have morning tea or lunch and you'd go to the staff room, but it was this tiny little tiny little room just, between patients' room and the nurses' station.
Yep.
And thinking back, you'd make your tea and you'd sit down and you'd flip through magazines or something. You didn't really get to turn off because, people would knock on the door and, need some drugs checked or something. Yep. But I love the idea that if you can leave the ward and go outside, and it just removes you, like you said, from that constant stimulation and needing to be like here, there, sort out everything, and just to have that exhale factor. I can imagine you go back to the ward after that break, refreshed, ready, and better, a better nurse or whoever you are for the patients.
Well, there's one of the theories behind a lot of the research is attention restoration theory. So even that, your attention is going to be restored, like your focused attention, because they talk about attention deficit, that you're just being drained. But if you go into a green space, it actually restores your attention. So, and at 40 seconds has other research has done. So looking at a green rooftop, 40 seconds already made people more attentive, more accurate in, certain tasks. So it doesn't take much. And it's even, as much as obviously and this is, I call it the priority of green space access, the priority is always to get somebody into a green space if you can. Like, you want to be out there, you want to feel the wind, you want to hear the noises, you want to touch things. So it's about being as physical an experience as possible. But if that's not possible, whether it's in healthcare because of infection control or somebody might not be in a state where they are able to walk, then sight or views onto an actual space is the second best. And third best is, okay, if you can't do any of that, or as in the case at the Austin in Heidelberg, is that there was a walkway that looked out onto two really plain rooftops. So just hardscape, nothing but, concrete tiles and yes, a little bit of sky, but not really nothing that even connected you, as we said earlier, to nature or the outside world. And so what got installed there was a photograph that got specifically commissioned for this space, which is of Talangi Forest. And so this decal now covers both sides of the walkway. And so it's like for 50 metres, you're walking through Talangi Forest. Yes, it's only an image, but it's a photograph, so it does, feel quite real. It's better than looking at a hardscape that couldn't be changed because you couldn't green those green roofs or those roofs. And staff have actually said to Stephen, thank you so much, because it is this little moment of respite. Yes, I know they're not real trees, but it feels like it, and it's just that way of bringing nature in at that very, very fundamental level. So if you can't have somebody walk through a garden like the people at Royal Talbot Rehab Centre do, you can at least give them that. And it helps on so many levels. So and that's what the evidence shows. And there's much more evidence now. I think there's been a real turn even before COVID, but COVID certainly elevated that whole need. And it goes back to exactly what you were saying about the staff room, because people weren't meant to be in the staff room. So it's like, well, where do we put them then? Because if you've got no space for them outside, or no space to gather or have your cup of tea or to meet, and so all these spaces outside got created and that awareness got raised, which is a good thing. Obviously now we're almost back to normal, but I think that awareness got raised. It's that idea that, if we can get people, give them the opportunity to go and have those spaces, that staff are a much greater focus in a lot of the research now, because yes, it's great for the visitors, and the the actual patients themselves. And there's, a really famous study from Roger Ulrich in 1984 that everyone is still quoting because it was the first thing that actually proved people that were in a room with a green view got better faster and more easily than people with a brick view, like a brick wall. But staff are the focus now as well because there's a lot of nursing burnout. And so, like Roger Ulrich has actually obviously continued his research, and when he visited the Swedish school that I was at, he talked about a study that was about to come out, which was about some green roofs in America and how they were specifically designed for the respite of nursing staff because they needed these spaces outside just to totally, and I think it's, as you say, not only is it the type of space that you're in if it's a room rather than outside, but it's also that change. You're not in that same environment. You're actually getting that break. It's different. And then obviously there's all the benefits of the colour green calms us. It's the fractals. It's, it's all of those things. But it just all works together to
so important.
help us feel better.
Yeah. And make us better.
Yeah.
To go back and be better at our work. Yeah. Better for the patients, and we all have a better experience.
Yep. Well, that's as I was saying earlier about how we're more empathetic, that's actually connected to attention restoration theory, is that if you are fatigued attention-wise, you're actually less empathetic. Like they've done tests where people are less likely to help somebody else in need if they're drained of attention. And you just think, whoa, we all need to get into a garden quickly, please, so that we help each other.
Especially night staff. No, only joking.
Everyone.
Yeah.
But then I guess that's the next sort of nuance of can you put lights in a garden so that they too can access that space, that it's not just daytime. Then you've got the whole conundrum of, light pollution and that sort of stuff. But I think, certainly it can be done. But I think that's where we're now heading with the research, is that we're starting to get into those nuances of how do we make this accessible. And I think it comes back to what you were asking about what the value of the book or the idea behind the book is if we value these things, we'll invest in them.
Well, it sort of ties into my last question before we hit some quick fire questions. If you could share one piece of advice into the ear of every city planner or garden designer today, what would it be?
Just build more of them. Yeah, just like put greenery wherever you possibly can, and it's not actually that hard. Like it doesn't have to be difficult. Yes, there's lots of, like often with street planting, it's like, well, it can't be a fruit tree because then the fruit will fall and people will slip, and I understand all that. But yes, there's lots of obstacles, but actually there's a lot more that can be done and a lot more that could be embraced to just put more greenery, because especially, and I think this is worldwide, but especially in Australia, when you look at comparative, aerial photos of suburbs from 30 years ago to now, there is no green space left. Like the blocks have shrunk and the buildings have got bigger. Like we are now the country that has the largest footprint of buildings, which is appalling. And I'm so ashamed that that's us, because it used to be America. But we now have the biggest houses. And I just think to change that focus from you don't need 3 rooms that have a TV in them. You don't need a butler's pantry. You probably don't need the extra bathroom that you have, even if it's a nice to have. How many people actually need that walk-in wardrobe? It's far more important to actually get some of that access to green space than it is the other way around. And I think if we did more as councils to actually really, to basically mandate that, so a bit of carrot and stick of going, no, you actually don't get to build your house from fence to fence. You have to have more green space. Not because, well, actually multi-focused. Yes, we need it because we need the permeable surface. So for the planet, it has to happen, but also for you, it has to happen. Like, I'm sorry, if you can't figure out that this is good for you, then we'll mandate it because this is better for your health and well-being. And then beyond the actual personal boundaries, also integrating that into just urban planning generally. Plant street trees. Like, why is the West less green than the East? That's ridiculous. There's no reason for that. As far, if you come down to, yes, it's probably money connected, but realistically, there's no reason for that. Why is the west of Melbourne any worse off than the east of Melbourne? That should not be the case. So, yeah, that would be my plea, is just bring back lots of it, because the more we lose it, the harder it's going to be to bring it back, because we're just ruining the soil and not making it accessible. And it's for us individually and the planet, I think. So.
Yeah, so good. Are you ready for some quick fire questions?
I hope so.
Okay.
See how I go.
Which do you prefer?
Oh, gosh.
Writing books or designing gardens?
Well, I haven't designed any gardens, to be fair, so probably I would prefer to do that. But no, writing books has been good so far. So, yeah, based on experience, can't really pick anything but write a book.
Okay, what is a green space or a garden anywhere in the world that you still dream of visiting?
Oh, gosh. I think the Eden Project is the first one that just comes to mind. I nearly got there this time. Yeah, the Eden Project, I think. But that list is endless.
But that's the first one on the list.
That's just one that I can come up with. Which other one? Oh, Beth Shadow. That's the other one I didn't get to. And looking forward to going back to Japan, because there's just amazing gardens there. But yeah, like I say, list is endless, so we'll just pick Eden Project.
Okay, in one word, how does your garden make you feel?
Good.
Awesome. If you could gift one living thing, so a plant, seed or tree, to every person on earth, what would it be?
To every person. The tree that first came to mind, but I know it's not everybody's taste, and there's an issue with it in that it's not particularly long-lived, like it only lives for about 25, 30 years, but maybe that would actually be a good thing. Silver birch, Betula pendula, because I love them. They're just beautiful. But in saying that, you couldn't have just one. Everyone would have to have at least three, because you have to have them as a copse. And I didn't talk about this before, but the landscape lab at Alnarp, so part of the setup of that is that it's these various spaces, and they were testing how wide a space, etc., do you need to actually feel that you're in a forest, because they're trying to work out how do we do these things in urban spaces. So like it's not Miyazaki method. I think that's the really dense microforests right now that are coming out. They were trying to work out like how much space do you actually need in an urban environment to feel that you're completely immersed in a forest. And it's only about 10 metres. Like it's not much. So 10 by 10, you'd pretty much feel like that. And so there's a part of the landscape lab forest at Alnarp, which is all birches.
Beautiful.
And I would just walk in, look up, and just see blue sky and the dancing birches. I've got so many videos of it. And a friend came from Australia to visit me there, and I said, I've got to take you to my favourite spot. This is it. It's the dancing birches. So that's why I'd give everyone it. Because then if you had three and the wind blew, you could stand in the middle and look up and have your dancing birches.
Oh, I love it. That's so good. Okay, last one. Mm-hmm. One person you'd love to have a cuppa with and hear their garden stories.
Gertrude Jekyll, who lived late 1800s and was very famous for her perennial and colourful borders. And she really understood colour, like how colour works. So she would create a border that like starts with, say, blues and then goes into greys and then becomes orange, so that your eye has been saturated with the blue, and the blue thereby affects how you see the orange. So the orange becomes even more vibrant. So the fact that she understood that and did it when she could hardly see herself. Not sure how cantankerous she would have been, because I've sort of heard that as well, but she just sounded amazing. And I've just been gifted a book about her designs with children. Thank you, Andrea. And I can't wait to read it. So, yeah, I think that's been my first person. There's plenty, but that's the first person that I would want to have a conversation with and just go feed me information so that I can learn from you.
Absorb it all.
Yeah, very knowledgeable woman and very creative as well.
So how can people find more about you and your book?
Mm-hmm. So the book at the moment is still on pre-sale, but as of the end of June should be available through Ingram Spark, who is the distributor that I'm working through. It's an independently published book and it's print on demand. So the idea behind that was never to have the glut of stock, but also it means that if somebody is in the US and buys it, it will get printed in the US. If somebody buys it in Australia, it'll get printed in Melbourne. So it's a little bit more sustainable in that way, and that is available on humannaturescapes.net. Now, human nature is just one N in the middle, so that's it may pop up otherwise, but yeah, humannaturescapes, one N.net. That's where that's available, and the aim of the website, once the book is actually out there, is also I will add, basically deep dive a little further into some of the stuff that couldn't go into the book. So I'm definitely planning on talking a little bit more about Horatio's gardens and Maggie's and that sort of thing. So that there should be new elements that might be of interest there as well. So that's where the book is available. But as I say, as of late June, it should be available in general online stocks of various providers. And I'm at the moment going around to try and look at who will stock it as bookshops. So hopefully keep an eye out in your independent bookstores, and please message me if you have a bookstore that you'd like it in. And then Instagram, I am human_nature_scapes.
Awesome.
And that's, as I've said to you the other day when we caught up at a Encouraging Women in Horticulture event, this is the year of the great unknown, so you never know where you're going to find me.
Hopefully everywhere. Well, I'll put the website and Instagram handles in the show notes as
Perfect.
well. Yeah.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, this has been an absolute delight. I've learnt so much. I have a list of places to go and add to my to-visit list one day, and a whole heap of plants to look up. But yeah, it's just been an honour listening to your stories, listening to your journey, and I'm just so excited for what's to come for you and to see how the whole field of, matching up therapy and horticulture develops and the results from your work.
Thank you
well
so
done.
much. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. It's definitely a growing field. It is. It's exciting, somewhat frustrating sometimes because we'd all like it to happen faster, but definitely a great journey to be on and something great to be part of. So yeah, hopefully my little contribution helps somehow, somewhere.
What I love about Sandra's story is how it proves that sometimes the most important research happens when we pay attention to what we already know in our bodies. We've always known that green spaces help us feel better, and Sandra's just spent years figuring out exactly why and how we can create more of them. Her work is both urgent but hopeful. Hopeful because the solutions are often simple. Plant more trees, give people more urban forests. Urgent because we're losing the very spaces that restore our attention and make us more empathetic to bigger houses on smaller blocks. When Sandra describes gravel paths as acts of kindness, or magpies waiting for their weekly bird bath refresh, I'm reminded that meaningful research gives us the language to fight for what we need, to prove that green spaces aren't luxury, they're therapeutic or medicine. You can find Sandra's book Restore at Human Nature, just one N with the two words, scapes.net, and follow her on Instagram at human_nature_scapes. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider subscribing wherever you do podcasts. New episodes are released weekly-ish, and you can listen to older episodes anytime on Apple or Spotify. A big thank you to Hayden Schuler from Varaya Gardening for the theme music and Tom Dowding for audio support. This is the Sentimental Gardener podcast, produced and edited by me, Cass Dowding. This podcast was recorded on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung and Bunurong people of the East Kulin Nations.